The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the tiny kitchen as the young chef stirred a pot of soup, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. Her name was Leila Monroe, a woman whose dreams had been carved from hardship and hope. Every morning before the sun rose, she would open the small doors of her rundown cafe on the corner of Ashwood Street, a place that once buzzed with laughter but now stood almost forgotten. The wooden chairs were chipped, the counter bore scratches from years of service, and the old sign outside had faded to near invisibility. But to Leila, it was still her home, her temple, her last piece of dignity in a world that had taken nearly everything else from her. Money had been tight for months, and the handful of customers who still came were mostly neighbors, too kind to let her starve. Rent was overdue, the electricity flickered often, and there were days when she would skip her own meals to stretch out the ingredients just a bit longer. Yet through it all, she held on to a quiet faith that kindness, in some strange way, always came back around. That morning was colder than usual, the kind that seeped into the bones and made every movement feel heavier. She had just enough ingredients left for one more meal, a simple stew made from lentils, carrots, and the last few herbs from her tiny garden behind the cafe. She told herself this would be her dinner, her one warm comfort after another long, slow day. As the pot simmered and the scent drifted outside, a figure appeared by the window, a man wrapped in torn clothes, his beard thick with neglect, his eyes sunken yet strangely bright. He stood there for several minutes, just watching, as if drawn not by hunger alone but by something deeper, perhaps the rare smell of genuine care. Leila noticed him and hesitated for a moment. She was starving herself, her stomach twisting from hunger, and she had no clue how she would afford another meal tomorrow. But when she looked at the man's trembling hands and the hollow desperation in his eyes, her heart made the choice before her mind could argue. She stepped outside, holding a small bowl of the steaming stew. "You look like you could use this more than I can," she said softly. The man blinked in disbelief, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. He took the bowl with both hands, trembling slightly, and the warmth of it seemed to melt some invisible layer of coldness between them. He sat down on the curb, eating slowly, savoring every bite like it was a feast. Leila didn't walk away. She stood there, arms crossed against the chill, watching with a quiet satisfaction that felt more nourishing than the food itself. She didn't ask for his name, and he didn't offer it. There was no exchange of promises, no expectation of return, just two souls crossing paths for a brief, sacred moment of humanity in a world that had forgotten such moments existed. Inside, she sat back down, her stomach still empty, but her heart strangely full. The act had reminded her of why she became a chef in the first place, not for fame, not for wealth, but because food was her way of showing love. It was her language, her form of prayer. She remembered how her mother used to feed the neighborhood children during rough times, stretching a single pot of soup to fill 10 bowls. "You never lose by giving," her mother would say, "because love always finds its way back." Those words echoed in her mind as she looked out the window once more, only to see that the man was gone. In his place, the bowl was neatly set on the ledge, cleaned, spotless, and beside it lay something she hadn't noticed before, small piece of folded paper. Leila opened it slowly, half expecting a thank you note, but inside was something she couldn't quite understand. It was a card, simple, elegant, embossed with gold lettering that read Maxwell Green, The Culinary Chronicle. Her heart skipped. The name sounded familiar. She vaguely recalled hearing it mentioned on the radio or seeing it in a magazine. Maxwell Green, the world's most feared and respected food critic, known for his brutal honesty and uncanny ability to spot authenticity behind every dish. But what would a man like that be doing, wandering the streets looking like that? The thought seemed absurd, and she dismissed it, assuming it must be an old card the man had picked up somewhere. Still, a strange feeling lingered. The next morning, she went about her routine as usual, though her shelves were almost bare. She swept the floor, wiped the counter, and brewed a pot of weak coffee, telling herself she'd figure something out. Around noon, the sound of an expensive car pulling up outside caught her attention. A sleek black sedan, the kind she'd only seen in movies, came to a stop, and a tall man stepped out, clean-shaven now, dressed sharply, though his eyes were unmistakably the same ones that had stared back at her through hunger just a day before. She froze, unable to speak, as he smiled faintly and walked in. "Miss Monroe," he said in a deep, refined voice, "I believe I owe you more than a thank you." She stammered, trying to find words, as realization dawned on her like a rising sun. He was indeed Maxwell Green. He explained that he had been traveling undercover, trying to understand the heart behind the culinary world once more, having grown disillusioned by luxury and pretense. Her meal, simple as it was, had been the most honest expression of love and flavor he'd tasted in years. He told her he wanted to feature her story, her food, and her heart in the next issue of his magazine. Leila's knees nearly gave way, her eyes welling up as she tried to comprehend what was happening. It was surreal. Yesterday she had nothing, and today she was standing in front of the man whose single review could change her destiny. But beyond the fame or opportunity, what struck her most was the look of respect in his eyes. It wasn't pity or charity, it was genuine admiration. She realized then that kindness, no matter how small or unseen, carries a power far greater than ambition or skill. That in giving her last meal to a stranger, she had unknowingly fed the soul of someone who could, in return, lift her out of the shadows she had been trapped in for so long. And as she stood there, speechless, surrounded by the same cracked walls and flickering lights, the cafe suddenly didn't feel so empty anymore. The man Leela had fed seemed like just another lost soul wandering through the city's forgotten streets. Yet behind the unshaven face and ragged clothes hid one of the most influential figures in the culinary world. Maxwell Green, the world-renowned food critic, had built his reputation on ruthless honesty and an uncompromising search for truth and flavor. He had dined in the grandest restaurants, tasted the rarest dishes, and been served by chefs who treated their plates like pieces of art. Yet, with every passing year, he felt something slipping away, a certain warmth, a soul that food once carried but now seemed replaced by pretension and perfection. The glittering dining rooms and expensive wines had begun to taste hollow. He could no longer find the authenticity that had first drawn him to this world. So, in a quiet act of rebellion and curiosity, he had left it all behind. He shed his wealth, his identity, his comfort, and walked into the streets dressed as a nobody, hoping to rediscover the raw humanity behind the act of feeding another. Days turned into weeks, and he wandered from city to city, sleeping in shelters, eating what little he could find. He observed people the way they cooked for their children, shared leftovers with strangers, or went hungry themselves so someone else could eat. He wanted to find the taste of truth again, that invisible ingredient that made even the simplest meal unforgettable. When he arrived in Leela Monroe's small town, he had already lost hope. He had seen greed in the rich and despair in the poor, but no sign of that pure, unguarded generosity he was seeking. Then, one freezing afternoon, drawn by the faint smell of soup drifting through an alley, he found himself standing outside a worn-down cafe. Through the fogged window, he saw her, a tired woman moving gracefully in her small kitchen, her every motion filled with quiet purpose. There was nothing glamorous about the place, no shiny signs or fancy plating, but something about her presence, the way she stirred the pot as if it mattered deeply, caught his attention. He lingered outside for a while, uncertain whether to go in. Pride whispered that he should keep moving, but hunger and curiosity anchored him there. When she finally noticed him and came out with a steaming bowl, his breath caught in his throat. She didn't ask who he was, didn't question his ragged appearance, didn't hesitate to share what might have been her only meal left. The warmth of that bowl seeped through his palms, a simple kindness he hadn't felt in years. He tasted the stew, expecting blandness, but what hit him was something indescribable: comfort, sincerity, love. The flavors were humble yet perfectly balanced, the type of taste that only someone cooking from the heart could create. Each spoonful carried the essence of someone who cared more about feeding another than about impressing anyone. For Maxwell, it wasn't just food it was a revelation. He watched her as she stood nearby, silent and content, her eyes soft with empathy. He realized she wasn't performing kindness. It was her nature. In that single act, she had reminded him of what cooking truly meant. It wasn't about awards, Michelin stars, or recognition. It was about giving a part of yourself to others. That night, as he walked away, the bowl cleaned and set down respectfully on her window. He left behind his card not as a test, but as a gesture of gratitude and faith. He wanted her to know that her act of kindness had reached someone who could tell the world about it. He wanted to see what she would do with it, whether she would recognize it for what it was. When he returned the next day, cleaned up and dressed as himself again, he could see the disbelief in her eyes. The woman who had given away her last meal now stood before a man who had the power to change her destiny. But Maxwell didn't want her to see him as a savior. He wanted to show her that her heart, her authenticity, was the very thing the culinary world was missing. Sitting at one of her old tables, he asked her to cook again, not for review, not for fame, but the way she always had, from her heart. She hesitated, unsure, but soon enough she was back in her element, moving through the kitchen with a quiet confidence that needed no validation. The ingredients were modest, the setting humble, but the meal she placed before him carried that same unpretentious warmth as before. As he ate, he realized how long it had been since food had moved him emotionally. Each bite felt like a story, each flavor a memory of struggle and love intertwined. He tasted resilience in the bread, patience in the slow-cooked stew, hope in the herbs she had carefully grown herself. He saw her watching him, nervous but proud, unaware that she was witnessing the rebirth of a critic's faith in his craft. For years, Maxwell had chased technical perfection, the perfect sear, the perfect seasoning, the perfect balance. But now, sitting in that shabby little cafe, he finally understood that perfection meant nothing without soul. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, soft but full of conviction. He told her that what she had done the day before, feeding him without judgment, without expectation, was the essence of true culinary art. That her food had something rare and irreplaceable: honesty. He explained who he was, how he had been searching for someone like her, someone who cooked not to impress, but to connect. She was stunned, unable to believe that her small act of kindness had found its way to the one man whose opinion could open the world's eyes to her little cafe. But Maxwell wasn't there to simply write a review. He was there to learn again, to be reminded of the humility that had once driven him. In that moment, both of them realized something profound. For Lila, it was the understanding that compassion, even when it costs you everything, never truly leaves you empty. For Maxwell, it was rediscovering that food, at its core, is a reflection of the heart behind it. The world might celebrate extravagance and fame, but the meals that endure are born from sincerity. He told her that he would feature her story in his magazine, not as a tale of charity or pity, but as a beacon of what true cooking means. He wanted to remind his readers that greatness doesn't always come from glittering kitchens and $1,000 ingredients. It can come from a single bowl of soup served by someone who believes that feeding others is an act of love. As they spoke, the afternoon light filtered through the dusty window, illuminating the worn tables and the faint steam rising from the pot. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that marks the beginning of something extraordinary. Leela, who had once thought her life had reached its end, suddenly saw a new path forming before her. And Maxwell, who had been lost in the excess of his own success, found clarity in the simplicity of a woman's selflessness. Two people from the news spread faster than Leela could have imagined. One day, her cafe stood quiet and forgotten. The next, it was buzzing with people eager to see the woman who had unknowingly served a meal to the world's top food critic. Maxwell Green's article, published under the title, The Taste of Humanity, was more than a review. It was a story that stirred hearts. He wrote about how, in a small, fading cafe on the edge of town, he had found what all the glittering restaurants of the world had lost. So, he described her stew not in terms of its ingredients, but in terms of its emotion, the warmth that lingered beyond the taste, the kindness that infused every bite. Within days, people began showing up, drawn not by fame, but by curiosity, wanting to experience that same feeling Maxwell had described. The once empty chairs filled up, and the air that had once carried only the scent of loneliness now buzzed with conversation, laughter, and life. Lila, who had spent years serving food in silence, now found herself surrounded by people thanking her for her heart, not just her cooking. It was overwhelming at first, the cameras, the interviews, the sudden rush of attention she had never sought. She wasn't used to praise or luxury, and she didn't quite know how to handle the spotlight. But what grounded her through it all was the same humility that had driven her to feed a stranger on that cold night. She didn't see herself as a hero. She only saw a woman who had done what felt right in the moment. Her story, however, became more than her own. It became a symbol of how a single act of compassion could ripple through countless lives, inspiring others to give selflessly, even when they had little to spare. Maxwell continued to visit, not as a critic anymore, but as a friend. He watched with quiet pride as her cafe transformed. Donations poured in from chefs around the country who had read his article and felt moved to help. They sent ingredients, equipment, even offers to collaborate. But Leela made one thing clear: her cafe would remain a place for everyone, not just those who could afford fine dining. She refused to raise her prices despite the growing demand. When asked why, she said that food was meant to comfort, not divide. She wanted her cafe to be a haven for anyone seeking warmth, whether it was a lonely traveler, a struggling family, or a tired worker needing a simple meal and a smile. Her kindness had become her brand, though she never intended it that way. As weeks turned into months, she noticed something magical happening. People didn't just come for the food, they came for the feeling. Strangers sat together at her tables and shared stories. Neighbors who had never spoken before became friends over bowls of soup. Musicians played in the corner, children laughed, and the once silent cafe had become the beating heart of the neighborhood. Her life, once filled with uncertainty and struggle, now pulsed with purpose. Yet even amid success, she never lost touch with her roots. She still woke up early, still chopped her vegetables by hand, still made sure each plate carried the same love as that first bowl she gave away. Maxwell often reflected on how her act had changed not only her life but his as well. Before meeting her, he had been drowning in cynicism, convinced that authenticity in the culinary world had vanished. But through her, he found redemption of his own. He no longer cared about the glamour or the luxury. He began writing differently, less about ratings and more about stories. He started a new column that focused on unsung chefs, home cooks, and ordinary people using food to bring others together. And each time he wrote, he remembered Leela's words, "You never lose by giving." That phrase became a quiet mantra for him, one that reshaped his perspective on his career, his influence, and his purpose. The day came when Leela was invited to speak at a culinary conference in New York, a gathering of world-renowned chefs and critics. She was nervous, unsure what to say to people who had trained in the finest institutions while she had learned everything from her mother's kitchen. But as she stood on that stage, looking out at the crowd of polished professionals, she realized that her story wasn't about technique or prestige, it was about heart. She told them about the night she gave away her last meal, not as a tale of sacrifice but as a simple truth. She explained how food connects people in ways that no accolade ever could. When she finished, the hall was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. Some of the greatest chefs in the world stood up, clapping not just for her words but for the reminder she had given them that beneath the artistry, cooking was still an act of love. Back home, her cafe became something more than a restaurant. It turned into a community kitchen on weekends, where people who couldn't afford meals could eat for free. Volunteers from all walks of life came to help, and Lila taught them not just recipes, but compassion. She said the secret to good cooking wasn't salt or spice, it was empathy. You have to care about who's eating, she'd say as she stirred a pot, her voice steady and warm. If you cook with love, it always finds its way into the food. Her words became a lesson that lingered long after the plates were cleared. The transformation wasn't only external. Lila herself began to heal in ways she hadn't realized she needed to. For years, she had carried the weight of failure, believing that her dreams had slipped away. But now she understood that success didn't always look like what she once imagined. It wasn't about wealth or recognition, it was about impact, about touching lives. She had given out of scarcity, and in return, life had given her abundance. Not the kind that filled her pockets, but the kind that filled her soul. As seasons passed, the cafe became a landmark, a story whispered in travel blogs and news features. But despite all the praise, Lila remained unchanged. She still wore her old apron, still greeted every customer with the same gentle smile, still kept that first empty bowl on a shelf by the window as a reminder of where it all began. Sometimes, when the day quieted and the last customers left, she would sit by that window with a cup of tea and think of Maxwell, the man who had seen through her kindness and shown the world her light. She knew that fate had brought him there for a reason, that their meeting had been more than coincidence, and somewhere in his office, surrounded by notes and photographs, Maxwell would think of her too. Whenever he felt disillusioned again, he would remember that small cafe and the woman who proved that the simplest act of giving could change everything. Her story became a testament, not just to the power of kindness, but to the truth that greatness often hides in the most ordinary places. Through her, he had found his purpose again, and through him, she had found her voice. Together, they had reminded the world that sometimes, all it takes to ignite hope is a bowl of soup shared between strangers.